Hello and welcome back to Topdeckers. I'm joined today by Jking, and we're going to be taking a look at the September/October balance change reveals. 3 cards have been changed, and this is just meant to reel in some of these sort of little bit more oppressive decks. And then one of the changes is a little bit more out the blue and unexpected, but 2 of them I think were sort of cards that had been spoken about by the community a little bit. We're just going to hop straight in with the first card being changed, Observer Core. It used to read, choose a card with cost 4 or more in your hand and reduce its cost by 2. The only change is now the card must cost 5 or more in your hand that you reduce by 2. This just means Credit Denial is not going to be able to combo off and hit you with some of these pieces on turn 2, such as Daylight Bombing, where they would just stop you ever reaching sort of 2 or 3 credits. It's not going to be quite as oppressive as it was before. They can still, hit you fairly early on because they, Britain has lots of other ways of reducing order cost. So it still may find its way into the meta and into the tournament scene, but it's not going to be as oppressive as it was before. But yeah, to me, Credit Denial is obviously what's being targeted here. A couple combo decks may have been caught in the crossfire, but to be honest, a lot of the combo decks that used Observer Core, like Spitfire OTK, have already been sort of pushed out the meta for various other reasons, and other cards being either changed or rotated. Jking, you're the expert here today. Is there anything I've sort of missed with Observer Core? Is there anything a little bit more deeper going on here, or is it simply just slowing down Credit Denial?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, absolutely, with this being a very, very targeted change for Credit Denial. That's the deck that this card has been running the vast majority of the time that it has seen any meaningful competitive play. You did touch on the Spitfire OTK, Spitfire Mark IIA, which is the 4/4 elite Spitfire that can get Fury, which is a very, very easy card to give Blitz. There's numerous ways, and we have seen a competitive version of that deck that uses that card to OTK the opponent, and Observer Core can be used to reduce Spitfire's cost by 2, making the combo slightly easier to pull off. Although that deck hasn't existed for a long time, the recent addition of the card Refit made that deck appear at least on my radar, and I'm sure on the radar of a couple other more combo-oriented players in the community. So this change will certainly make people probably think twice about trying to build that deck. And then there's 2 other cards that I think that have seen play with Observer Core, since this change exclusively really affects cards that cost 4. One is Potez. We've seen some players playing Britain, France Mobilize run Observer Core as a way to just reduce the cost of Potez on the turn that you're going to combo off with playing all your Mobilize guys. You could use it to essentially just do it for 2 credits cheaper or 2 turns sooner. However, that wasn't super common, and there was other cards in that deck that cost more than 4 that you would sometimes play the card on anyways. So that's not a big deal. And the other thing is Britain US Ramp in Hour of Need, the 4 cost gain 2 credit slots. If you could get that out on turn 2, that would be a big help to Britain US Ramp, although that was less common than just running War Machines to get it out on turn 3. So overall, I think Credit Denial is really the only deck that's being affected in a way that is going to have a huge impact on the deck. I think things like Brit US Ramp, Brit France Mobilized, those are decks that are just going to adapt and run different cards. That's perfectly fine. Whereas with Credit Denial, I think you're going to have to seriously rethink how you build the deck, because that wasn't just 1 or 2 copies of Observer Core to potentially get out something quick. That was traditionally 4 copies, and it worked really well with the Crusaders. So now suddenly there's a void of 4 cards in the deck, and also the deck's consistency in the early game is a lot worse. So maybe you need to run more anti-aggro, you might need to run more card draw. I think people are going to have to figure it out and figure out whether or not Credit Denial is worth still trying to play.
I mean, we've had sort of these Britain combo control decks where you try and win with Commonwealth a lot. We used to have various different ones, often quite commando focused ones. Do you think there's any chance that as Credit Denial maybe leaves, there's going to be a different sort of deck which fills its slot using that Britain slot? Because obviously Brit Air used to be your Britain slot. That used to be what took your Britain slot in tournaments. And now since Credit Denial's come along, the Britain slot was used by Credit Denial a lot of the time. Do you think this is going to open the door for other British decks? Maybe something Brit US, maybe some commandos? Or do you think we're probably not going to see as much Britain as we used to in competitive play?
Well, I certainly think that we're going to see less Britain, at least in the first month or two, just because anytime there's a change, people, particularly competitive players, they're kind of scared to jump into the untested waters of building Britain that's not credit denial post-rotation. However, I think Britain has a ton of potential. I think it's easily one of the strongest nations in the game right now, from a competitive point of view. And I know personally I already have a few ideas on things to do with Britain. And I think the most popular ones that are come to mind, you mentioned a few of them, the Brit-France Mobilize, the Brit-US Ramp, as well as I think there's some possibility of air coming back, Brit-US Air, Brit-Japan Air, as well as commandos. You mentioned Reichsbank's commandos, I think, is a deck that has a ton of potential right now in the meta. So we could see some of that. And all around, I think this is going to just bring a lot of diversity into Britain as a nation, both on ladder and in tournaments.
I do say the audio clip of you saying Britain is one of the strongest nations is going to be cut, and it's going to be posted all over the Steam forums and the Cards Discord whenever someone loses to Britain as a nation. The next card we're going to look at is Shano. Now, Shano used to be distribute damage to enemy cards equal to the number of cards on the battlefield, and this has been changed from number of cards on the battlefield to number of units on the battlefield. Now, this might be a little bit of a confusing change for some people. The wording isn't completely clear at what it means by this, and it's really simple. It simply doesn't count HQs anymore. So it used to count all the units on the battlefield as well as the 2 HQs, so the HQs counted as cards. So it's essentially going to do 2 less damage ticks every time you cast it. So if there's 3 units on the battlefield, instead of doing 5 damage distributed randomly across the enemy units or enemy cards, it's now going to do 3 damage instead. This is quite a large change. If you're looking at it where you're usually going to have, I don't know, 2 to 4 units on the battlefield, there generally won't be many more than that. Otherwise, Shano is just going to still be a lot of damage like it was before. But in this sort of 2 to 4 units, we're looking at this doing, instead of doing 5 damage with 3 units on the battlefield, we're now doing 3 damage for 3 credits, which is essentially a random from the people, which can occasionally burn face a little bit. So you're getting a lot less bang for your buck. Now, they did talk about this trying to affect Jagra a little bit, but one of the sort of archetypes which is really affected by this are control archetypes. Obviously, Legions often has a lot of units on the battlefield, and Legions may continue to want to run Shano because they get so many units on the battlefield, but a lot of control decks that don't get these huge amount of units, they are now punished a lot more by this card's sort of nerf, because you're not getting these HQs into account, which was really quite a big deal for some of these control and AoE decks. So the questions I have is Jagro still going to run this? Is Jagro even going to care? I mean, it's obviously not on Desperate Measures level like it was before, where it was sort of one of the most nuts cards in the games. But yeah, is this still going to see play? Is this still going to see play in Jagro? And is Jagro just going to not care at all? How do you feel about this change, James?
So, absolutely, I think Shano is still going to see play, just because it is a very popular card. It's a card that a lot of people have. And it's going to be a card that can still feel good in certain situations. So I don't think you're going to see this mass exodus away from Shano. However, from a purely competitive point of view at the tippy top, bringing in tournaments, I don't think I'm going to be bringing Shano in any Japan deck list. It just seems far too weak for me at the moment. If you're running it in Jagro as a AoE sort of clear, it's just so much weaker now, because if you're trying to get it to hit a single target, that's 2 less shots you're firing, which if it's a single target, on average, you're dealing 1 less damage with the Shano, which is quite a big deal. As well as, if how you often play it in Jagro is in the mirrors, where you'll play it out early, on turn 3 or turn 4, where there'll be, say, 2 units on the board, each having 1 health. And you'd fire 4 shots, and the most common outcome would be removing the 2 units. However, now it will fire 2 shots rather than 4, and suddenly it makes it a lot more likely to not actually accomplish what you want, and in those situations, it will just be strictly worse than Tora Tora. If you're playing Shanano without any units on the board for yourself, it is just a strictly worse Tora Tora. And then the other situation you would play it in is if you have a lot of units on board and you're trying to play it largely as a burn card. And I just don't think Jagro needs a burn card. They simply win at the moment through overwhelming card advantage and void advantage. They don't need a voider that is useless if you're, or largely useless if you're on the defense and can deal a lot of burn damage if you're already winning the game. So I don't see Jagro or any version of Japan Control playing this at a competitive level. However, I look forward to somebody trying to prove me wrong on this. Maybe there's some ways you run this, it still accomplishes something. If you can get a few units on the board and your opponent has a few units on the board, it's certainly not going to do nothing.
I mean, I think one of the things I find just entertaining about this change is I've seen a lot of people complaining about this just in general. And it's interesting because if they had just released it as the, nerfed version, people would be perfectly happy with it as a mid-tier Japanese elite. People would be like, oh, that's a pretty cool mid-tier Japanese elite, but it's only because we've seen this sort of spicy competitive version that now it's being changed and people are like, why have you done this? But yeah, Jagro, like you say, it just sort of, it's got so much card advantage at the moment with expansions drawing you 2 cards for 1 credit, which is such a ridiculous rate that it sort of doesn't mind losing this as much. So you think Jagro is going to be just as competitive as it was before? Do you think it's going to go down from maybe sort of top tier to second top tier because of the change, or is it just not really going to mind?
So I think this change, arguably, is almost a buff to Jagro. And that does seem crazy to say, so I will explain this a little bit. But the number one matchup where Shanano is most important in Jagro right now, pre-nerf, is the mirror match. So losing a card that is the most important card to have in the mirror match, it doesn't actually have an impact on the strength of the deck. And in most other matchups, it's kind of just a fine card. Like, it's a bit of a win more card. And if instead of Shanano, you just have, another Akita, you have another Whirlwind, or just another unit to throw onto the board, in most matchups, that's gonna be fine. And where it gets into the point of being a buff to Jagro is, as I previously mentioned, Shanano is the number 1 card to have against Jagro, but that is true for other Japan decks outside of Jagro. So you do have decks like the Japan-German discard, the Japan-Poland legions, and those cards, or those are decks that absolutely ran Shanano, and those were decks that absolutely hard mulligan for Shanano against Jagro. And now they just do not have that option anymore. Whereas Shanano for Jagro against those decks is substantially less important. So I think in a lot of ways, Jagro is going to come out of this particular change better. The change to Observer Core, which is going to result in the substantially reduced popularity of Credit Denial, is going to open the doors for a lot more control decks, I think, for a lot more new ways to try to deal with Jagro. So as a whole, across the meta, I'm not sure if Jagro is going to get better, but for the Shanano change in particular, I do think Jagro is coming out on top, despite getting one of their most popular elites nerfed.
It's a really interesting way of looking at it, that if a card is only strong in the mirror and it gets removed, it just gives you an extra slot to run against other decks. And you're not fussed that it's gone for the mirror because your opponent's also lost it for the mirror. So it's sort of, the mirror is still equal, but against other decks, you now can run something more useful. So that's a really interesting philosophy to look at it, and it makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't thought about that. The next card, and the final card, which is a bit of a weird one, is the 164th Infantry Regiment. This is a 1-drop for the US with 0 operation cost. It's a 1/1, and it has the destruction effect, give a random unit, random friendly unit, +1/+1. Hold on, I'm going to redo that bit. The next card, and this is the final card, and it's a little bit weird, it's a 1k US 1-drop. It's the 164th Infantry Regiment. It's a 1/1 with the destruction effect, give a random friendly unit +1/+1. Now, the only change to this is that they are giving it Blitz. Now, this is a very sort of out-of-pocket change. I don't think anyone was expecting this to be changed. I don't think anyone had really been looking at US 1 drops that need changing. We did lose the 32nd, which is the Chocolate Boys, so there has been a little bit of a void for 1k infantry, so I wonder if this is why this is sort of coming into light a little bit more, to try and fill that void a bit. But for Frontline, for example, Greyhound has been doing a perfectly fine job of filling those 1 slots. I'm personally not fully convinced that this is better than Greyhound in Frontline. You can trade with it and buff your other units, and it is really nice for developing your Sherman draw, because on turn 5 you can play this, move it to the front line for nothing essentially, and draw from your Shermans. And this destruction effect is okay for trading, but it relies on you having other units which are going to be able to utilize this buff. So it's going to be really interesting to see how in Frontline this and Greyhound battle it out. One of the other ways where this is actually... this is the first thing which came to mind, and this is just a comment on how terrible my brain is sometimes. You know what my first reaction to this was, Jking? My first reaction was, is this a Skytrain buff? Now, I want you to think about, if anyone watching thinks about that for a moment. Skytrain adds the unit at end of turn, and this is Blitz. So the answer is most definitely no, this is not a Skytrain buff.
Honestly, if you think about it, in some ways it actually becomes a Skytrain nerf, because it now means that the unit dies to unexpected resistance.
That is true. However, if the unit gets Leopolded back to your hand, you can then Blitz it out again. So it's the the Skytrain discussion, the great Skytrain debate. Is this a Skytrain nerf or a Skytrain buff? But yeah, so other decks this could be played in, you can run it in this sort of Japan USA infantry aggro deck that uses Unity and Bicycle to try and just rush down your opponent as quickly as possible. This can be played there now as an extra 1-drop, but you are a little bit thin on your US drops as it is. You don't have that many slots, and they're quite competitive, those USA slots for that deck. And then other decks which run it could be something like a Tokens deck could want to use this, or maybe a Faz deck. But overall, I don't see this being a huge change in the meta. I mainly see Frontline being affected by this, on whether it wants to run this or Greyhounds, maybe a bit of both. Is there anything I'm missing there? Is there anything I'm just completely wrong on? What's your thoughts on this?
So, in terms of how it affects the meta, I think you're absolutely right, in that it comes down to a debate of Frontline, whether you want to run this or Greyhounds, and I do agree, I think Greyhounds are just the better choice because of their synergy with, just because tanks are better units. The additional 2 health means it sticks around a bit more. It's more likely to stick around for a Sherman draw. Like, the 164th cannot trade and then do something else in the future.
I'd like to know, the Blitzkrieg as well is a huge thing for Greyhound. This, obviously, you can't blitz this up and Blitzkrieg it in 1 turn.
Yes. So Greyhound offers damage from hand, in a way that the 164th does not. One thing I have been considering, the more I look at this card, is there a world where you cut combat engineers for the 164th in Frontline? Maybe it's not, do you remove Greyhound? Maybe you run a couple 164ths alongside full stacks of Greyhound and the double Red Devils. And the thing that makes me come to this conclusion is the 109th combat engineers, the number one thing it is used for is getting that turn 2 3 attack 35T, which was so important against air because of these 1-3 units in the support line. Outside of combined arms, which is not really meta relevant anyways, there's not a lot of decks that run 1-3 units in the support line that you really want to be getting to. Jaguar is the number 1 opponent of Frontline right now in terms of contesting the Frontline. So as long as you don't have the front line, the combat engineers doesn't matter. And once you take the front line, most of Jaguar's units have 1 health, so the attack of your unit is not particularly relevant when it comes to trading. So rather than having a card which passively buffs the attacks of cards that you get into the front line, maybe you make a Jaguar meta call and run 164th instead, which gives you a bit more versatility in trading out the cavalries or the bicycle regiments that get to the front line on turn 1, or you can use them later to try to take out these annoying Japanese units in the front line for much cheaper than you otherwise would with the combat engineers. However, the number one biggest thing that this is going to have an impact on is on the Cards speedrunning community. The 164th, massive buff to US speedrunning.
That is true. I hadn't considered how these changes affect the speedrunning. I mean, Observer Corps and Shano, not that popular in speedrunning, but 164th now with Blitz. The USA, is it Lonely War is the category for mono decks? I believe it's Lonely War. For anyone who's missing the context here, a while back, myself, Baron, and Jking, we found that Cards speedrunning was a thing, and we all got involved and started speedrunning Cards and trying to win these. You play against the AI and you try and beat it as quickly as possible in different categories. And I should put a bit of a disclaimer that if you're going to do this, you should probably do it with a bit of caution, because we were doing this. We spent a good few hours, which says something about us as people, all sitting there speed running Cards. And then the next day we got a message from one of the developers at 1939, and they said, hey, just to let you know, when you were speedrunning or whatever the hell you were doing, it got detected by our bot detection system, and it had flagged all 3 of your accounts as bots. And you almost all got your accounts banned from the game. But we noticed it was you guys, and we thought we'd reach out and ask you what was going on. So luckily for us, they noticed that, hey, these are some well-known players. They're probably not botting on their full collection accounts. Yeah, it's actually, I don't know if you ever uploaded some, but I uploaded a couple of my card speedruns to my personal YouTube channel, so you can see what we're talking about there. And it's it's certainly a statement about our loneliness in life, you know.
Yeah, I just looked it up, and apparently I had 179 matches that lasted less than 65 seconds.
Oh, that's good. I mean, you know, because you would mulligan, and if you didn't get the perfect hand, you would just start over and over and over and over until you got it. And it turned out for the regular category, the max number, the quickest you could win was essentially the same for all the nations, because you would just do Japan Ally and just do Bicycle Regiment. And it was like, I'm just going to bicycle win on like turn 3 no matter what nation I play. So I found Lonely War and Singleton and these things far more interesting categories, because it wasn't just drop bicycle, speed run, go.
Yeah.
God, what a terrible use of our time.
Massive buff to US Popper.
US Popper too, you know, you got to think about Pop here. When's Popper coming to ladder? I want the Popper ladder. We've got regular, we've got classic, we've got regular, we need Singleton and Popper on ladder, and then I'll be happy. That's when I'll make my competitive return to Cards, is when Popper, ladder, and Popper 1939 tournaments are a thing. Don't hold me to that. All right, well, thank you for joining us, Jking. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening to us ramble about our sorts of thoughts and opinions. Thank you for giving some sort of expert opinions to the changes, and it's going to be really interesting to see how they pan out, to see how the meta gets affected by this, especially now that credit denial is out the way a little bit more. There's maybe a little bit less supply shortage going around, because credit denial was one of the decks that loved supply shortage. So I'm going to be very interested to see how this affects the upcoming OCCs, and we will catch you guys next time. All right, there you go. That's good.
Before you leave, make sure to take a look at our Discord server, a friendly hub where you can continue the fun after you watch our content by chatting with the Topdeckers team and the rest of the community. If you wish to take on a more special role, you can also check out our Patreon and enjoy the perks that come with helping us bring you the best content possible. See you in the next video!